With the implementation of the National Park Service in 1916, the mission statement of the NPS stated that it was to be active to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration for this and for future generations. Now this means no matter the history, no matter the story, no matter how controversial, it was our job as the Park Service to preserve and share that. Now the story of Shenandoah National Park even predates the park itself. While it opened its doors in December of 1935 and later dedicated in July the following year, it was actually 1926 that the story really got the ball rolling as far as becoming a national park. Now this is going to be very important to our story later on. But as time went on, again, we opened our doors in 1935, dedicated the next year, and within the very first year, this park was a huge success, a major hit, because we were based on accessibility. So back in the 1920s, when this idea of a new national park in the eastern United States came about, it was because back in those days, if you were a traveler going to a national park, you were largely going to be heading west. Maybe getting on a train, hitting the rails for a week, going out to, say, Yellowstone or Yosemite, traveling around by caravan for another week, hopping back on the train to go back home. It was not accessible or feasible for the millions of people living in the eastern United States at the time. So Washington, D.C. and the Department of the Interior got this idea of bringing an eastern park in a western tradition. Now what that means is the tradition that you think of with the big wilderness western national parks, that could be found right here in the eastern United States as well, where the millions of people living in the cities would be. So during that time, places like Great Smoky Mountains in North Carolina and Tennessee, Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, and yes, right here in Shenandoah in Virginia, those came about to be opened as the next big eastern parks in that western tradition. Now, when we opened our door, of course, we started putting in the facilities and the infrastructure, Skyline Drive, that millions of people love to drive each and every year. And we became a very, very popular spot for a Sunday drive from the cities. So this means all of the great natural resources and beauty that bring people out still to Shenandoah National Park were now accessible to the millions of people living around the area in the turn of the century, 1900s. Now, we were actually the very first national park to reach over 1 million visitors in a single year because we were within a mile of millions, whether coming out for a long-standing family trip or even just going for a scenic Sunday drive on Skyline Drive. If you were a visitor, say in 1938, there would be a lot of amenities and facilities available to you. For example, there were 2 lodges still standing to this day. Skyland Lodge, for example, was already a very popular spot on the mountain. A variety of restaurants and campgrounds, picnic areas as well, and wayside general stores where you could stop and get more supplies for your trip through Shenandoah. All of these would be available to you within the park unless you were African American. You see, for African American travelers in the 1930s and throughout the 1940s, the one place in Shenandoah National Park where they were welcome to stay was the segregated campground of Lewis Mountain. But how exactly did this happen in a national park? Well, the thing is, remembering back to the 1920s, leading up to us opening our doors as a national park, Shenandoah was specifically designed to be segregated. Arthur Desmarais, at the time the Associate Director of the National Park Service, so stated that when it came to Shenandoah National Park, they were going to conform with the generally accepted customs long established in the state of Virginia. Now, what this meant is, during those days, and dating all the way back to the end of the Civil War, Virginia and the rest of the South was segregated. Of course, Beginning in 1966, the war ends the year prior, and now formerly enslaved individuals are pushing for their own personal freedoms and citizenship. So throughout several civil rights acts, 1866, 1875, and then in 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson agreement in court, the separate but equal policies of early civil rights were instated. Now, what this meant was that facilities for whites versus colored travelers and visitors and citizens could be separated. There could be whites only, there could be colored only, but they had to be deemed equal. Now, here in Shenandoah National Park, there were, again, all of those other restaurants, those facilities, those lodges, those campgrounds. Lewis Mountain Campground, at the time, did not have picnic tables, did not have fire pits, did not have much of the amenities that you would find in other picnic areas of its kind. But before we go into the descriptions of these areas, it's good to know some of the other big players in this story. One of the large components of this was a gentleman by the name of Harry F. Byrd. He was the governor of Virginia at the time and was actually a big proponent of what made Shenandoah a national park. He actually headed the commission that handled the funds for this to open its doors. Now, he was also a staunch segregationist. Going well into the 1950s, he was avowed to prevent integration socially to happen. Another big player in this game was the Secretary of the Interior at the time, Harold Ickes, pictured here. Now, even for those days, especially for those days in the 1930s and 40s, Ickes was very progressive. Not only was he heading the Department of the Interior, but previously he was actually the Chicago chapter director of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, what this meant for him, and especially as secretary overseeing these public land areas, is that he was not in favor of segregation. However, he did have concern. And what Ickes' main concern was for Shenandoah National Park and others to become what he referred to as jurisdictional islands. In other words, a federal landscape surrounded by state land that followed segregation. And what it would mean for the people, what it would mean for potential conflict or controversy if this island of integration then rose up. Would there be pushback? Would there be protest? And he was concerned that the park would face a lot of that instigation. So he, of course, conceded, and Shenandoah National Park followed the separate but equal. But if you'll remember, Lewis Mountain did not have a lot of the same amenities. So in 1939, a year later after this picnic area opened, a federal solicitor, a lawyer for the national government, came in to assess the different amenities and facilities throughout this new national park. And the report he gave back to Ickes was that, while yes, certainly the facilities were separate, Lewis Mountain was not even close to equal. Now, this started a ball rolling, which would tumble down and create the progress, create the change of what we see now in the story of Lewis Mountain. After he received the report, Harold Ickes, of course, applied pressure for Shenandoah to bring about those equal, truly equal facilities for Lewis Mountain Campground. The concessionaire at the time, Skyline Company, who operated the campgrounds, lodges, and restaurants, gave pushback against this mandate. They said that it would be financial failure if Lewis Mountain were properly facilitated for African American visitors. They backed this up by stating that all of their other amenities, those lodges, those restaurants within the park, well, African American visitors haven't expressed any interest in recreating at those facilities which by law were not open to them. So with more pressure applied, by 1940, the rest of Lewis Mountain Campground was rushed to completion, with cabins, picnic areas, tent stations, and even a wayside general store. Much of what we see in Lewis Mountain Campground remains unchanged still to this day. Of course, with new accommodations in the segregated campground, there had to be proprietors to manage it. And the two people hired to oversee this operation were a married couple by the names of Lloyd and Amelia Tutt. Now, the Tutts were actually fairly familiar with the mountain as of this time because Lloyd had previously worked down at the former presidential retreat Rapidan Camp under Herbert Hoover, where he was a cook. So when they came up to Lewis Mountain, they had a vision of what they could turn this place into. And by all accounts, immediately on opening day, this was a very, very popular spot within the park. Now, a large part of that was not only due to the amenities for African American visitors and travelers coming to and from, regardless of where they were traveling from, but it was also the culture and community that the Tutts brought as well. A large part of that came down to the home-style cooked meals which they prepared and provided their guests right here in what was originally their lodge dining hall and now stands as our wayside general store. It was said by visitors that they could smell the fried chicken or the home-baked goods that Amelia prepared all the way out on Skyline Drive, and that drew in weary travelers. But on top of that, after dinner is when the festivities truly began, as they would clear out the main hall for an open dance floor. In a later interview in 1970 with Lloyd Tutt about his time here as the proprietor of Lewis Mountain Campground, he said that the joint was hopping. We had a piano and a Nickelodeon, so there was music and dancing every night. We had some of the best singers in there, and they would come in and have the biggest jubilee and dance and things that you ever heard of. So truly, within this national park, which up until now had not been accessible truly for everybody, it's now become the place to be almost overnight. And even so, Lloyd and Amelia were told when they took charge of the Lewis Mountain area that they were not to allow any form of integration. That is, it would only be African Americans staying within the campground. Many times throughout his time being the manager of the area, regardless of race, as people would come in looking for a place to sleep, if there was availability, Lloyd and Amelia would let them stay. So even years before the park truly desegregated, Lewis Mountain kind of became this isolated island of desegregation within the mountains. Not only did Lewis Mountain Campground become a hotspot within the mountain itself, but it also became known nationally, and this was largely thanks to being published in the Green Book. What the Green Book was a guide for safety, a guide for travel for African Americans and others that were traveling through the South during this era of segregation. For example, if you were a musician from the northern states traveling south of the Mason-Dixon line, you want to know what hotels to go to, what restaurants will accommodate you, and where you are welcome. As a National Park Service ranger, I tend to think of this as my hiking trail guide. If I'm going to a new outdoor area, I want to know what's the distance, what am I going to see, how am I going to remain safe for me and my family. The Green Book was very much so the same thing. Now, with Lewis Mountain Campground and Lodge being featured in this book, that means that people from the whole nation over knew that they were welcome here if they were to visit Shenandoah National Park. Not only did this receive national acclaim now, but it also received acclaim locally. For much of the surrounding valley outside of Shenandoah National Park, the local communities were also facing that same segregation. Many of those communities would recreate here in the park as we stood within their backyard. Now with that, many of those African American communities that were segregated in their own homes, they knew that they could come up to Lewis Mountain for potlucks after church, family outings, birthday parties, and other such events. That means that Lewis Mountain Campground remained a vital, important, and memorable spot for those families and those communities even long after it desegregated in 1950. But the story and path to desegregation was not yet finished. There is still more of Shenandoah National Park where change had to come. Along with the implementation of all the facilities coming to Lewis Mountain Campground, beginning in 1939, Harold Ickes also wanted to begin the ball rolling to desegregate other areas of the park. It wouldn't be until 1940 when he started looking for other areas that could face that desegregation process. He will be later quoted as describing Shenandoah as a race relations laboratory, a place where he could test out these potential desegregation areas and kind of see where it would lead. So he had Shenandoah National Park select one of their picnic areas, this being Pinnacle's picnic area, which still stands to this day in the park, and that was to be the next picnic area to be fully integrated. On top of that, 2 restaurants at Thornton Gap and Swift Run Gap, respectively, had their restaurants allow colored seating indoors. You see, up until this time, if you were an African American visitor to Shenandoah, sure, you could order to go from the restaurants, but you were not allowed to dine in with the white patrons. Instead, you could sit at staff tables to eat your meal, because much of the staff at the restaurants at the time were also colored. Now, with this, the superintendent of the park showed concern, Ralph Lassiter. He was concerned that if we started integrating these areas throughout Shenandoah, throughout the mountain, these picnic areas, these restaurants, we were going to start seeing a clash amongst the visitors. He was concerned there would be pushback and possibly even violent interactions. Well, if ever those happened, they were few and far between, and Ickes later described it as a great success. So he wanted to push a little bit harder and see how much more change could be brought to the park. Later on in that same year, he encouraged the park to remove any indication of colored only or white only on all park literature. So this is things like the park maps and brochures that you receive at the park entrance stations. There would be no telling of what was a segregated area versus what was not. Now, again, Lassiter, the superintendent, shared his concern, stating that how will African American visitors know where they are rightfully allowed to stay, such as Lewis Mountain, if we don't put it on the map as a segregated area? Well, over time, all of the signs dictating white only or colored only, including on the Lewis Mountain Negro area campground itself, or comfort stations, like this formerly segregated colored only bathroom that I'm standing by here at Stony Mountain Overlook. That signage was removed, and over time they started being used as an integrated area. Once we get into 1941, of course, we entered a war. World War II was already raging on, and now the U.S. is entering into that, and tourism throughout the national park systems all but stops. This is largely in part because of gas rationing and people not having the time, not having the money to be able to travel as much. So essentially, Shenandoah National Park almost closed its doors for a 4-year period. We didn't see much tourism, much travel coming through this area. Now that gave Ickes time to think and time to plan. Once the war ended in 1945, tourism became a boom again, and we anticipated that that would be one of the biggest years to date for the summer of 1946. And with that, Harold applied pressure again to the Skyline Company, encouraging them to fully desegregate the national park, to fully integrate all of the facilities, the restaurants, the lodging, the picnic areas, and campgrounds. Well, the owner and CEO of Skyline Company, gave pushback. He said, absolutely not. We will not desegregate our facilities. And if you force us to, we will pull our contract. Well, again, this is shortly before what was expected to be the busiest season on record, and it would have been a catastrophic failure financially for the park if all of their lodging closed during that time. So they bided their time for another year. The CEO of Skyline Company retired the following year in 1947, and shortly thereafter, these areas were desegregated. As the years went on, coming into 1950, all of Shenandoah National Park had fully integrated its facilities to all and become accessible to all. Late in the year of 1950, another federal solicitor, another lawyer for the government, came out to assess what was separate, what was equal, what these facilities were offering, and he reported back to Washington, D.C. that Shenandoah was truly fully desegregated. So what is the value in our history? The story of Lewis Mountain is one of exclusion, is a story of racism, and is a story of large controversy, yes. But it is also a story of change and how things, no matter how dire, can change for the better. Shenandoah National Park and other national parks were founded on accessibility for all. These public lands are ours and everyone's to come out and experience and enjoy. Now, that means that this story is our story too. Our story to share, our story to preserve unimpaired for this and for future generations. So if Shenandoah National Park, this jurisdictional island amidst the Jim Crow and segregated South of the time, if they could change, so could other places. If they could change for the future, so could the rest of America. So this story and many others like it are important to share and preserve unimpaired because we learn from history in order to change for the future.